Preface. This volume arrives as the logical and necessary precursor to a sequence that began with limits and continued with practice. Preservation and Horizons detailed the structural theory of difficulty, the inevitable cost of maintaining coherence as a system advances. Preservation in Practice outlined the ethical and operational discipline required to honor those limits, the conscious, deliberate art of stopping. Together, they answered why systems encounter boundaries and how they should respond. But a prior question lingered, unasked and unanswered. Where does the thing to be preserved come from? Before a system can preserve an invariant, before it can encounter a horizon, or execute a deliberate halt, it must first possess an invariant to defend. It must have something that matters. This book addresses that genesis. Its subject is formation, the process by which raw, undifferentiated possibility becomes a defined, maintainable structure. Formation is the initial act of attention, the first commitment, the selection of what will be preserved from the infinite field of what could be preserved. The argument here is foundational. Structure precedes preservation. You cannot maintain what has not been formed, and the manner in which something is formed dictates the costs and contours of its future preservation. This is not a metaphysical or historical treatise. It is an operational inquiry into the mechanics of beginning. Just as preservation fails locally, formation succeeds locally. It is the binding of attention to a specific difference, the naming of a distinction stable enough to be carried forward. Understanding formation completes the intellectual arc. If preservation is the maintenance of meaning, then formation is the selection of what will mean. This book maps that selection. It explores the substrate of potential, the moment of recognition, the cost of commitment, the fragility of new structure, and the ethical weight of choosing what will be. It is the story of how things become things, how chaos becomes pattern, how noise becomes signal, and how possibility becomes rule. Contents. Book 1. The Substrate of Potential. Chapter 1. The State of Uncommitted Difference. Chapter 2. Discernibility. The Prerequisite for Formation. Chapter 3. The Observer and the Observed. Chapter 4. Potential Invariance. What Could Be. Book 2. The Act of Formation. Chapter 5. Recognition. The First Binding of Attention. Chapter 6. Naming as Commitment. Chapter 7. The Locality of Beginning. Chapter 8. The Trigger. Why Formation Happens Now. Book 3. The Cost and Consequence of Commitment. Chapter 9. The Trade-off of Specificity. Chapter 10. Exclusion and Opportunity Cost. Chapter 11. Irreversibility and Path Dependence. Chapter 12. Energy of Formation. Book 4. The Life Cycle of New Structure. Chapter 13. Fragility of the Newly Formed. Chapter 14. Survival as a Filter for Fitness. Chapter 15. Amplification from Local to Global. Chapter 16. Stabilization and Integration. Book 5. The Limits of Formation. Chapter 17. The Horizon of Formation. Chapter 18. Unformable Distinctions. Chapter 19. Substrate Limitations. Chapter 20. Recognizer Constraints. Book 6. Pathology and Error. Chapter 21. Bad Formation. When Structure Harms. Chapter 22. Misformation. The Illusion of Distinction. Chapter 23. Overformation. The Burden of Needless Invariance. Chapter 24. The Cost of Correction. Book 7. The Practice of Intentional Formation. Chapter 25. Designing for Formation. Chapter 26. Substrate, Selection and Preparation. Chapter 27. Tuning the Recognizer. Chapter 28. Protocols for Testing Stability. Book 8. The Ethical Dimension. Chapter 29. The Responsibility of Beginning. Chapter 30. Consent and Impact in Formation. Chapter 31. Revisability and Humility. Chapter 32. Forming for Resilience, not Rigidity. Book 9. The Handoff to Preservation. Chapter 33. Signs of Readiness. Chapter 34. The Preservation Protocol. Chapter 35. Inherited Fragility. Chapter 36. The Continuous Loop of Reformation. Book 10. Beyond the Cycle. Chapter 37. The Unmaintainable. Chapter 38. The Never Formed. Chapter 39. Ephemeral Structure. Chapter 40. The Silence of the Substrate. Conclusion. The Complete Arc. The Trilogy Synthesized. Formation as the First Discipline. Afterward. The Work Ahead. Book 1. The Substrate of Potential. Chapter 1. The State of Uncommitted Difference. Before a system preserves anything, everything is candidate. This is not a state of nothingness, but a state of pure potential. Differences exist. Variations in temperature, sequences of symbols, patterns of behavior, gradients of value, but none have yet been designated as necessary to maintain. No line has been drawn between signal and noise. No rule has declared this difference meaningful and that difference incidental. This substrate of uncommitted difference is the raw material of all future structure. It is rich, undifferentiated, and dense with possibilities. In computational terms, it is the full space of possible states before an algorithm begins to filter. In cognitive terms, it is the blooming, buzzing confusion of sensation before attention focuses. In organizational terms, it is the set of all possible processes before a procedure is documented. Key property: neutrality. The substrate does not advocate for any particular invariant. It merely presents differences. The choice of what to form belongs entirely to the recognizer, the system or agent that will engage in the act of formation. Key property: plenitude. The number of potential invariants is vast, often infinite. Any slice of reality contains more discernible differences than can ever be formed into maintained structure. This plenitude ensures that formation is always a choice, never an inevitability. Chapter 2. Discernibility, the prerequisite for formation. For formation to be possible, differences in the substrate must be discernible. A difference that cannot be detected cannot be formed into an invariant. Discernibility is the gatekeeper of formation. Discernibility depends on two factors: the resolution of the substrate. How fine-grained are its differences? Can it support subtle distinctions, or only coarse ones? The sensitivity of the recognizer. What differences can the observing system detect? What is above its threshold of perception? Example: a digital image is a substrate of pixels. The difference between adjacent shades of gray may be discernible to a high-bit depth sensor, but not to a human eye. That difference is formable for one recognizer, not for another. The discernibility horizon. There is always a boundary beyond which differences become too fine, too faint, or too slow to be reliably discerned by a given recognizer. This is the first and most fundamental limit of formation. Chapter 3. The Observer and the Observed. Formation is not a passive emergence. It is an active transaction between a substrate, the observed, and a recognizer, the observer. The recognizer is the system that performs the act of attention, that applies the filter, that makes the commitment. The recognizer can be biological, a sensory nervous system; mechanical, a sensor or measurement device; cognitive, a mind applying a concept; social, a group agreeing on a norm; computational, an algorithm applying a rule. The properties of the recognizer determine what can be formed. A recognizer tuned to seek symmetry will form different invariants than one tuned to seek efficiency. A recognizer with a short memory will form only immediate, persistent differences. A recognizer with cultural biases will form distinctions that reinforce those biases. There is no formation without a recognizer. The invariant is born in the interaction. Chapter 4. Potential invariants. What could be? A potential invariant is a discernible difference that could be selected for preservation. It is a candidate waiting for recognition. We can categorize potential invariants: explicit differences, clear, sharp boundaries in the substrate. For example, the presence or absence of a physical object. Implicit patterns, statistical regularities, correlations, or rhythms that require processing to detect. For example, a seasonal trend in temperature. Relational properties, differences that exist only in comparison. For example, greater than, parent of, upstream from. Abstract constructs, differences projected onto the substrate by the recognizer. For example, beauty, efficiency, fairness. The substrate is a field of these sleeping possibilities. Formation is the act of waking one up. Book 2. The Act of Formation. Chapter 5. Recognition, the first binding of attention. Recognition is the primal act of formation. It is the moment the recognizer's attention locks onto a specific difference in the substrate and treats it as relevant. This is not mere detection. Many differences are detected and ignored. Recognition is detection plus selection. The mechanics of recognition. Filtering. The recognizer ignores most of the substrate, focusing on a narrow bandwidth of difference. Pattern matching. It compares incoming data to an internal template, which may be innate, learned, or designed. Threshold crossing. A confidence level is reached. The difference is deemed real enough or significant enough. Binding. The recognizer allocates cognitive, computational, or institutional resources to hold this difference in mind. It is tagged as noteworthy. This binding is temporary and fragile. Without the next step, the recognition will fade, and the difference will dissolve back into the undifferentiated substrate. Chapter 6. Naming as commitment. To stabilize recognition, the system names it. Naming is the act of assigning a persistent token, a label, a symbol, a code, a term, to the recognized difference. Why naming is essential. Externalization. It moves the invariant from a transient state of mind to a shareable, storable artifact. Re-identification. The name allows the recognizer, or another, to find the same difference again. Look for X. Manipulation. The name becomes a handle for reasoning, rule-making, and communication. It enters the system's vocabulary. Naming is the point of no return in lightweight formation. It is the commitment to treat this difference as a distinct, recurring entity. The name becomes the invariant's first stable representation. Chapter 7. The Locality of Beginning. Formation, like preservation, is inherently local. It always begins in a specific context, at a specific time, with a specific instance. Context dependent. The first recognition of fairness happens in a particular dispute. The first recognition of a software bug happens in a specific run of the program. Instance anchored. The invariant is initially tied to the concrete details of its first appearance. The abstraction comes later. This locality explains why early formations are often idiosyncratic, anecdotal, or biased. They are born of particular circumstances. The challenge of amplification, Book 4, is to generalize the locally formed invariant without losing its essential distinction. Chapter 8. The Trigger. Why formation happens now. In a substrate of constant difference, why does formation occur at a particular moment? What triggers the recognizer to bind attention now? Common triggers. Novelty. A difference appears that violates expected patterns. Pain/pleasure. A difference is associated with a strong reinforcement signal, reward or punishment. Utility. A difference is seen as instrumental to achieving a goal. Instruction. An external authority dictates what difference to recognize. Contagion. A neighboring or admired recognizer has formed an invariant, prompting imitation. The trigger often embeds itself in the history of the invariant, influencing how it is later perceived and preserved. Book 3. The Cost and Consequence of Commitment. Chapter 9. The Trade-off of Specificity. Formation requires choosing a level of specificity. An invariant can be formed narrowly or broadly. High specificity. The temperature must be 22.5 degrees Celsius. This is precise, easy to verify, but hard to satisfy and fragile to change. Low specificity. The temperature must be comfortable. This is flexible and robust, but difficult to verify objectively and prone to interpretive drift. The trade-off is fundamental. Precise invariants are costlier to form, require finer discernment, but cheaper to preserve, clear verification. Vague invariants are cheaper to form, but costlier to preserve, require ongoing interpretation and narrative. Formation involves tuning this dial, often unconsciously. The initial setting creates a legacy of future preservation costs. Chapter 10. Exclusion and Opportunity. Cost. Choosing one invariant excludes others. Attention and resources allocated to maintaining accuracy are not available for maintaining speed. The system that forms an invariant around centralized control makes it harder to later form an invariant around team autonomy. Opportunity, cost of formation. The potential invariants that are not chosen represent paths not taken, capabilities not developed, values not embedded. This cost is hidden but real. A system's early formations can lock it into a structural trajectory, making alternative futures increasingly difficult to form later. Chapter 11. Irreversibility and Path Dependence. Formation is often irreversible or reversible only at great cost. Once an invariant is named, amplified, and integrated into a system, removing it can cause cascading failure in dependent structures. This leads to path dependence. The future state of the system is profoundly shaped by its early, seemingly small formations. The first rules coded into a software platform. The first norms established in a team. the first principles adopted in a scientific field. These initial formations create attractors and constraints for everything that follows. You cannot simply unform an invariant. You must engage in a costly process of dissolution and reformation. Chapter 12. Energy of Formation. Formation requires energy. This is literal in physical systems. Forming a crystal requires cooling a solution, and metaphorical in social and cognitive systems. The energy investment includes attention, the cognitive focus of the recognizer. Communication, the effort to name and explain the new invariant to others. Conflict resolution, overcoming resistance from those invested in other potential invariants. Documentation/encoding, the work of moving the invariant from mental recognition to external rule. This initial energy outlay is the down payment on preservation. Systems with limited energy for formation will form fewer, coarser invariants. Book 4. The Life Cycle of New Structure. Chapter 13. Fragility of the Newly Formed. A newly formed invariant is profoundly fragile. Its recognition is tentative, its name is unfamiliar, and it has no allies in the existing structure of the system. It exists as a single, weakly supported assertion. Sources of fragility. Counterexamples. A single instance where the difference fails to appear or behave as expected can shatter the formation. Forgetting. Without reinforcement, the name and its association fade. Competition. Other, stronger invariants or new formations draw attention and resources away. Substrate shift. The underlying context changes, making the original difference obsolete. This fragility is a natural and necessary filter. It tests the invariant's resilience and connectedness to reality. Chapter 14. Survival as a Filter for Fitness. Most formation attempts fail. The nascent invariant encounters the friction of the world and dissolves. Only a subset survives this initial filter. What confers survival fitness? Utility. The invariant proves immediately useful in achieving a goal. Coherence. It aligns with, or can be integrated into, existing structures. Reproducibility. The difference it names occurs repeatedly and reliably. Advocacy. A powerful recognizer or group champions it. Survival is not a judgment of truth or moral goodness. It is a judgment of structural fit within a specific environment and system. Harmful, false, or arbitrary invariants can survive if they are useful to powerful recognizers or fit pre-existing biases. Chapter 15. Amplification. From local to global. For an invariant to transition from a fragile local observation to a stable part of the system, it must be amplified. Amplification mechanisms. Repetition. The invariant is recognized in multiple diverse contexts. Each repetition strengthens the pattern. Institutionalization. It is written into manuals, encoded in software, or enacted in law. Propagation. It is taught to new members, broadcast through communication channels. Tooling. Tools are built that assume or enforce the invariant, making deviation physically or socially harder. Amplification is the process of building a body for the invariant, giving it multiple points of contact with the system so it is no longer dependent on a single instance or recognizer. Chapter 16. Stabilization and Integration. The final stage of formation is integration. The invariant is linked into the network of other preserved invariants. It becomes part of the system's worldview. Logical integration. If we preserve A, and B is a subset of A, then we must also preserve B. Procedural integration. The check for the new invariant is added to a checklist or workflow gate. Cultural integration. The invariant becomes part of the shared story. That's just how we do things here. A fully integrated invariant is robust. It draws strength from the system around it. Its preservation is no longer a special case. It is a default consequence of the system's normal operation. At this point, the work of formation is complete, and the work of preservation begins in earnest. Book 5. The Limits of Formation. Chapter 17. The Horizon of Formation. Just as preservation encounters horizons, so does formation. A formation horizon is a limit beyond which a recognizer cannot stably form an invariant from a given substrate. Causes of formation horizons. Resolution limits. The differences are finer than the recognizer can discern. Noise. Threshold. The signal of the difference is drowned in random variation. Conceptual poverty. The recognizer lacks the mental or symbolic categories to grasp the difference. Energy constraints. Forming the invariant would require more attention or resources than are available. When a system repeatedly fails to form a desired invariant, it has likely reached a formation horizon. The solution is not to try harder with the same recognizer and substrate, but to change one or both. Get a better sensor, filter the noise, develop a new concept, or allocate more energy. Chapter 18. Unformable distinctions. Some differences are fundamentally unformable for a given class of recognizer. For example, a colorblind recognizer cannot form an invariant based on red-green differentiation. A system without a concept of self cannot form the invariant personal property. A computer without a temporal memory cannot form an invariant about trends. Unformability is absolute within a recognizer's operational framework. It represents a blind spot in its reality. Chapter 19. Substrate limitations. The substrate itself can limit formation. If the substrate is too homogeneous, noisy, or chaotic, it may not support stable, discernible differences of the kind needed. You cannot form an invariant about customer preference if you have no data on customers. You cannot form an invariant about chemical purity if your measurement tools are contaminated. Chapter 20. Recognizer constraints. The recognizer's own structure is the ultimate constraint. Its sensors, its processing algorithms, its memory, its biases, and its goals determine the possible world of invariants it can inhabit. A recognizer designed for efficiency will form a world of bottlenecks and waste. A recognizer designed for safety will form a world of hazards and mitigations. We do not see the world as it is. We see the world our formation apparatus is built to see. The recognizer's constraints are the sculptor of reality. Book 6. Pathology and Error. Chapter 21. Bad formation. When structure harms. Not all formation is beneficial. Bad formation occurs when a stable, enforceable invariant is formed that causes net harm, injustice, or unnecessary constraint. Types of bad formation. Exploitative. Forms an invariant that benefits the recognizer at great cost to others. For example, profit maximization above all. Exclusionary. Forms an invariant on a distinction that should not matter for human dignity or fairness. For example, invariants based on race or gender for access to rights. Brittle. Forms an overly precise invariant that makes the system fragile to necessary change. For example, We only ship on Fridays. Superstitious. Forms an invariant on a coincidental correlation, mistaking it for causation. Bad formation is often stable and preservable. Its harm lies in its consequences, not its structural integrity. Chapter 22. Misformation, the illusion of distinction. Misformation is the forming of an invariant on a difference that does not objectively exist in the substrate. It is a hallucination of structure. Causes: recognizer error, a glitchy sensor, a biased algorithm, a cognitive illusion, like pareidolia, seeing faces in clouds. Overfitting, mistaking noise for a meaningful pattern because of excessive search or desire. Deception, a malicious actor fabricates data to trigger a false formation in another recognizer. Misformed invariants are often revealed when preservation fails repeatedly under honest scrutiny, or when they clash with other, more robustly formed invariants. Chapter 23. Overformation, the burden of needless invariants. Overformation is the creation of too many invariants, or invariants that are too specific, creating a suffocating web of rules. The system's energy is consumed in preserving distinctions that provide little value. Symptoms of overformation. Bureaucracy. Every action requires checking against a vast rulebook. Inflexibility. The system cannot adapt because any change violates some minor invariant. Exhaustion. The cost of preservation approaches or exceeds the value the system provides. Overformation is a failure of discernment, an inability to distinguish between a difference that must be preserved and one that merely could be. Chapter 24. The cost of correction. Correcting a bad, mis- or overformation is exponentially more costly than the initial formation. It requires dissolution, disintegrating the invariant from the network of rules and beliefs that depend on it. This can cause cascading confusion and temporary collapse. Unlearning, getting recognizers to stop seeing the old difference as relevant. Reformation, the energy-intensive process of forming a new, better invariant. Reintegration, weaving the new invariant into the system. This high cost is why early formation is so critical, and why ethical formation, Book 8, is a necessity, not a luxury. Book 7, The Practice of Intentional Formation. Chapter 25, Designing for Formation. We are not passive victims of formation. We can design systems, technological, social, cognitive, to form better invariants intentionally. This is the practice of formative design. Principle 1. Substrate first. Carefully choose or prepare the substrate to make desirable differences highly discernible and undesirable noise minimized. Principle 2. Recognizer aware. Know the biases, limits, and capacities of your recognizer. Design checks and balances. Principle 3. Test before scale. Stress test newly formed invariants in low-stakes environments before amplification. Chapter 26. Substrate selection and preparation. If you want to form invariants about customer happiness, your substrate must be rich in genuine customer feedback, not just sales data. Preparation involves instrumentation, adding sensors or feedback loops, filtering, removing known sources of noise or distortion, diversity, ensuring the substrate represents the full range of relevant conditions. A clean, rich substrate is the foundation of good formation. Chapter 27. Tuning the Recognizer. The recognizer can be tuned. This can mean calibration, adjusting thresholds for detection, for example, sensitivity versus specificity. Training. Providing labeled examples to teach the recognizer what differences are important. Multiplicity. Using multiple, diverse recognizers to cross-verify formations. Reducing individual bias. Feedback loops. Building mechanisms for the recognizer to learn from the success or failure of its past formations. Chapter 28. Protocols for testing stability. Before amplifying an invariant, subject it to stress tests. The counterexample search. Actively look for situations where the difference fails to hold. The boundary test. Push the context to its limits. Does the invariant still make sense? The utility interrogation. What tangible good does preserving this difference achieve? At what cost? The integration simulation. Model how it would fit with existing invariants. Will it create conflict or coherence? A protocol-based approach replaces charismatic intuition with disciplined verification, even at the stage of formation. Book 8. The Ethical Dimension. Chapter 29. The Responsibility of Beginning. Formation is an act of power. To form an invariant is to declare, "This shall matter." With that power comes profound responsibility. The formative act shapes the reality that others will then inhabit and be constrained by. The ethical imperative of formation. Consider the downstream preservation costs and human impacts of an invariant before you form it. Do not form carelessly. Chapter 30. Consent and Impact in Formation. When a formation will affect others, ethical practice demands consideration of impact and, where possible, consent. Impact assessment. Who will bear the cost of preserving this invariant? Who will benefit? Participatory formation. Can those affected be involved in the recognition and naming process? This is the difference between a rule imposed and a norm built. Transparency. Is the process of formation and the identity of the recognizers open to scrutiny? Chapter 31. Revisability and Humility. Ethical formation builds in revisability. It acknowledges that our early recognitions may be partial, biased, or wrong. Mechanisms for revisability include sunset clauses. Invariants expire unless consciously renewed. Amendment protocols. Clear, accessible processes for changing formed rules. Cultural humility. A shared stance that this is the structure we have formed for now, subject to learning. Chapter 32. Forming for Resilience, not Rigidity. The highest goal of ethical formation is not to create immutable laws, but to form meta-invariants, invariants about how to form and reform. Examples. We preserve our capacity to learn. We preserve the dignity and voice of participants. We preserve the ability to stop and change course. These are invariants about process and adaptation. They create systems that can outgrow their own initial formations. Book 9. The Handoff to Preservation. Chapter 33. Signs of Readiness. How do you know when formation is complete and preservation should take over? Signs of readiness. Stability. The invariant has survived stress tests and no longer changes with every new data point. Clarity. It can be named and explained unambiguously to a new member. Verifiability. A clear local check for the invariant exists. Integration. Links. Its relationships to other key invariants are understood. Chapter 34. The Preservation Protocol. The handoff is a formal moment. The formation team, or process, delivers to the preservation system. The named invariant. The verification method. The known dependencies. The designated stop role from preservation in practice, who is authorized to halt if preservation fails. This protocol prevents orphaned invariants, structures that everyone assumes are being preserved, but no one is explicitly tasked with maintaining. Chapter 35. Inherited Fragility. The preservation system inherits any unresolved fragility from the formation phase. If an invariant was formed on shaky evidence or integrated hastily, it will be the first to fail under preservation pressure. The preservation system must be aware of this inherited technical debt and monitor accordingly. Chapter 36. The Continuous Loop of Reformation. Preservation is not the end. As a system operates, its substrate changes, and its preservation efforts encounter horizons. This triggers the need for reformation. A preservation halt is called, using the discipline from preservation in practice. The system re-enters a formation state, analyzing the new context. It may dissolve the old invariant, modify it, or form a new one. The new or revised invariant is handed back to preservation. Formation and preservation are thus phases in a continuous cycle of structural adaptation. Book 10. Beyond the Cycle. Chapter 37. The Unmaintainable. Some beautiful, true, or important distinctions are recognizable but unmaintainable. They can be formed in a moment of insight, but cannot survive the grind of preservation. The perfect mood of a collaborative meeting, the precise alignment of a one-time opportunity, the fleeting consensus on a complex issue. These are ephemeral invariants. Their value is real but transient. Systems that try to force them into permanent preservation exhaust themselves. Wisdom lies in appreciating the ephemeral without demanding it last. Chapter 38. The Never Formed. The vast majority of potential invariants are never formed. They are the silent background of reality, the differences that no recognizer ever tuned itself to see. The unique pattern of moss on a particular stone, the specific acoustic signature of an empty hallway at 3 a.m., the microscopic variations in each manufactured part deemed within tolerance. This unformed multitude is not irrelevant. It is the reservoir of potential from which future formation can draw if recognizers change. It is the guarantee that reality is always richer than our models of it. Chapter 39. Ephemeral Structure. Some structure exists solely in the act of formation, with no preservation phase. A brainstorming session forms ideas and connections at a rapid pace, only to let most of them dissolve. A conversation forms a shared understanding that exists only for its duration. This ephemeral structure is vital for creativity, exploration, and relationship building. It is formation for its own sake, a dance with possibility without the burden of permanence. Chapter 40. The Silence of the Substrate. Beneath the formed, the preserved, the unmaintainable, and the never-formed lies the substrate itself, silent, neutral, and endlessly generative. It does not care what we form. It simply is. Our formations are local, temporary patterns drawn upon its infinite canvas. Recognizing this silence is the ultimate humility. It reminds us that our structures, however necessary, are our creations. We are responsible for them, from their first formation to their final halt. Conclusion: the complete arc. With this volume, the trilogy finds its beginning and completes its arc. Formation, this book. The origin of structure. How we select what will matter from the field of all possible differences. The ethics and mechanics of beginning. Preservation and Horizons, Book 1. The theory of maintaining structure. The inevitable cost of coherence, the emergence of difficulty, and the nature of limits as preservation exhausts local resources. Preservation in Practice, Book 2. The discipline of respecting limits. The art of the deliberate stop, the design of ethical systems, and the cultivation of trust through refusal. The sequence is logical and necessary. You form an invariant. You attempt to preserve it, encountering horizons. You practice the discipline of stopping at those horizons, which often forces you back to reform. This is the full cycle of meaningful action in a complex world. Form, preserve, stop, reform. The trilogy provides a complete framework. A diagnostic lens. What stage is this system in? Is it a formation, preservation, or stopping problem? An operational toolkit. How do we form well? How do we preserve efficiently? How do we stop cleanly? An ethical foundation. What responsibilities do we have at each stage? Formation as the first discipline. Ultimately, the quality of everything that follows, the ease of preservation, the clarity of horizons, the grace of stopping, is determined at the beginning. Careless formation begets costly preservation and traumatic halts. Disciplined, ethical, humble formation creates structures that are fit for purpose, resilient, and worthy of the energy required to maintain them. Therefore, the first and most profound discipline is not preservation or stopping, but formation. It is the discipline of choosing wisely what we will commit to, what we will ask ourselves and others to carry forward. It is the discipline of beginning well. Afterward. This third book closes the conceptual circle. The work that began with an analysis of limits ends with a theory of origins. The trajectory is now whole, from the birth of structure, through its costly maintenance, to the conscious decision to let it go when coherence fails. What remains is not further theory, but the perpetual, practice-focused loop itself. The work ahead lies in applying this integrated framework to the systems we code, the organizations we build, the knowledge we pursue, and the lives we shape. May we form with intention, preserve with clarity, and stop with courage. And may we have the wisdom to know which phase we are in. Jonathan Kendall. Divi Tukstoshi Divdesmit Septini.